Greetings, everyone, and I am here this evening. The gentleman that's in my frame is Brandon Tatum, and I wanted to this video. He titles this video "White Privilege, My A asterisk asterisk." Okay, and you get the picture. He did this video because he's speaking out and saying that, and we're gonna hear a clip here in just a moment. He's speaking out against this, white privilege, and we're going to hear some of his thoughts. Now, I'm going to be sharing two things I'm going to do with this video. This first video that I'm producing even now, I'm going to use a clip from him to open up my presentation of my understanding of this concept of white privilege. I'm going to use that. I'll use a clip from him to do that, and then in a second video, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do a walkthrough of his video, not all the video, but high points, because I want to make some comments on some of the things that I've heard this gentleman say that I believe is kind of off base. But let me begin by saying this, and then we're going to go to the clip. The first thing I want to do regarding my view of white privilege, I want to change that phrase to class privilege, and we're going to work with that. Maybe that's less offensive, but we need to understand something that looking into class privilege has nothing to do with calling particular people racist. There's a passive aspect of this privilege, and there's an active active aspect of this privilege. And there may be people who are part of this and not even fully aware. There may be people who are part of this and they weren't obviously a part of the structuring of this. This goes way back. But the reality is, this has to do, and it's not just a Caucasian thing. It's any culture where there's a privileged class, where there's a class, a ruling class, if you will. Now, for those who might be wondering or saying, well, what do you mean ruling class in America? There's no ruling class in America. Well, let me help you with that a little bit. Going back in the times of slavery, who was the slave master and who was the slave? And when you figure that out, when you figure out who was a slave master, then you understand who was the ruling class in America. And this ruling class, and anytime there's a ruling class, whether it's America, whether it's in India, where there's a caste system, and there are those that are at the top of that caste system, and they experience caste privilege, class privilege. And there are those that are at the bottom of that caste system called the untouchables, and they're not getting a whole lot of class privileges. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't matter, and you could call that brown privilege. If you were in India, if you're in Africa and you're part of the big tribe, if there's a ruling tribe over there and you're the warlord over this ruling tribe or what have you, you call that black privilege. In any culture where there's a ruling class or a class that has the lion's share, if you will, of power, and they are going to experience certain aspects of privilege, and we're going to look deeper in that in just a moment to understand why. In America, it was Caucasians, folks. So whether you were part of putting that structure in place or you just benefit from it. Now, maybe you don't, and we're going to look at the benefits that come from being a part of the ruling class. It may not be anything that you consciously go out to try to make happen. It's just embedded in the system. That's a reality. There's enough research that's been done on this. There's enough data that's been done on this. Anyone who truly wants the truth concerning this matter, believe me, there's ample information concerning it. Those who try to act like it doesn't exist is just either you just extremely ignorant, or, and I'm not necessarily saying that in a negative way, you just ignorant. You just don't understand. You're either extremely ignorant or you just don't want the truth, and you're in some form of denial. But let's listen to this gentleman now.
I get offended when people say stupid things about other people that's unjustified.
Now, I agree with that statement. You should get offended when people say stupid things that are unjustified. Well, folks, as I just pointed out, there's nothing stupid or unjustified by the reality that there is in this country a ruling class. I mean, you can deny that. Now, there are things that have gotten better, but there are things still that are in place, and we're going to see again that there are certain things that are yet happening in this country. There has been a ruling class. There's been a ruling class, and out of that ruling class comes privilege. And whether you want to accept that, realize that, acknowledge it or not, it's true. So there's nothing nonsensical about this. It's just simply a reality.
I tell you, as sure as I'm sitting here, I had many friends on the police department that were white. Some of them had stories of overcoming adversity that I could not even begin to understand. They had situations, social, economic situations that they were in that blow my mind. As a black man in America, I have never dealt with some of the things that some of them had dealt with. Period. And so when I see people bring up this false narrative that all white people somehow have this privilege from birth, is the stupidest thing that I've ever heard.
Okay. And again, there's a few things going on here. This privilege from birth. Again, this young man, he clearly does not understand certain aspects about the very society and culture that he lives in. I call this way of thinking, and I see it in him, and he's like almost a clone of Candace Owens, and I see it in her reasoning, and I call it the bubble syndrome. And it's the bubble syndrome is this condition where you reason only as far as the bubble that you're in. This little bubble of awareness, a bubble of influence, bubble of your little circles that you're in, your little circle of experience, your circle of friends, and you don't realize that there outside that bubble, there's a whole world of experiences and goings on. That just because it hadn't happened in your particular bubble or in your particular experience doesn't mean it's not happening. Now, one of the critical logic fallacies that this individual is arguing from and arguing with is called the fallacy of exception. And he doesn't realize it, but the fallacy of exception is, you heard him say, well, his argument basically goes something like this. There is no such thing as white privilege because I know some white people that had it better, worse than I did. And that's his argument. That's the argument wow. That's the argument that's the fallacy of exception. That's the logic fallacy of exception, that you think that because you can find some exceptions to an established rule, that somehow that negates the rule. And that's fallacious reasoning, and that's exactly what he's doing. And let me say this, and I'm gonna offer some examples here that this class privilege has nothing to do with not going through hardships and having $1 million or stuff like that. Now that there are some opportunities that are there, but everybody's not going to be wealthy. Even in the ruling class, everybody is not going to have tremendous wealth. Even in the ruling class, there's going to be challenges and difficulties. Even within the ruling class, exceptions do not negate the reality. And so, we're gonna look at that further. But he seems to be, he seems to be stuck on that, in that reality. And I call it again the bubble syndrome. He just cannot see beyond the little bubble that he's in. And you'll hear more of that if you watch that whole clip. And but let me move now into what I want to share about these what I'm calling class privilege. Again, I made the statement that if there's a ruling class, if there's a class in a particular society that is technically the ruling class, that class will experience certain privileges that no one else will experience, or will experience only to some degree, but not obviously as much as the ruling class. Now, some say, well, I'm offended that you call in the Caucasian the ruling class. Well, let me again let me say, in the days of slavery, uh, uh, black folks wasn't the masters. Okay, white folks were. Okay, that means that, I mean, clearly, if you can't see that, I'm not the ruling class here. The ruling class is Caucasians. Now, let me lay out a progression. Well, let me do a couple of things to bring some clarity and some greater focus to this. Now, there are two quotes that I want to use to help establish this. One quote from Frederick Douglass. One quote from John. Let me see if I can remember his last name. John Austin, I think it is. Frederick Douglass and John Austin. Now, Frederick Douglass said this. Both of these quotes are referencing power. Okay, we talked about the ruling class in any community, any society. Obviously, the ruling class is going to be the class that has the power. We're going to work on that in just a moment. Now, Frederick Douglass said this about power. He said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will. Power concedes nothing without a demand. We see this in the civil rights movement, in the modern day civil rights movement. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, black folks got tired of being oppressed and treated with disrespect, sitting in the back of the bus. All kinds of indignities that transpired, not being allowed to be hired. Our money was good, but treating us with respect, their powers that be that wasn't going to have that. Well, the blacks in that community decided to place a demand on the power structure, those who were in power, the ruling class, because that protest, that boycott was successful, and the ruling class did everything they could to try to sabotage and shut it down. But because it was successful, the powers that be were brought to the table, and change came. Now, it didn't change everything, but it was a beginning. And all of a sudden now, black people could sit wherever they wanted on the bus, and they could even work for the bus company, and other opportunities and things opened up. And it really set a precedent for some powerful changes to happen all throughout the state and in other states as well. So now, this is what that means, that power is not those in power. A power will concede nothing. Power concedes nothing without a demand. So that means that a demand has to be placed on the ruling class, on the power, those who possess it, in order to have equity in that power, to share in some of that power. Now, Acton, Lord Acton, John Acton, he made the statement concerning power. He said that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, let's do this, and in a moment I'm going to tie all this together. But this is where these two quotes tie in. Now, the power structure, and it's just like it happened in the Montgomery bus boycott. When the blacks in that community and the black citizens placed a demand on the power, that was a pushback. All right, because anyone who's in power, like Frederick Douglass said, they're not going to give that power up willingly and easily. There's going to be resistance. So there's a pushback. Now, in that pushback, those in power feel that when someone comes to try to take that power, that's threatening their way of life. So there are those that will push back, and push back many times with hostility. And that's exactly what happened. Hostility, violence. And so this is where Acton's concept of power comes in. Power tends to corrupt. See, that desire to maintain that power and not share it, it began to lead to corruption. It began to lead to this frame of mind of by any means necessary. See, that's why in this struggle for equity, in power, for the black community struggle for equity in power in America, many have died. See, because there was a pushback that became corrupt. The desire to hold on to that power was such that by any means necessary, we're going to stop those who are trying to take and gain equity into our power. And so we have the deaths, the killings. We have all kinds of things, the Jim Crow laws that took form and took shape, you see, because that was the pushback. And when you have absolute power, it corrupts absolutely. And that's why we have images like the Birmingham bombing, and we have situations where, you know, individuals sat in court cracking jokes, and murderers cracking jokes and cocked back, chewing on, you know, chew tobacco, because they they knew they weren't going to see one day of prison. Yet they took lives, but they knew, because the structure favored them. The structure, this is privilege. See, in its worst form. Some might argue, say all of it is bad, but you know, you sitting here knowing that you're not going to see a day of jail time, and you just killed and took someone's family member, someone's loved one, and know that you're not going to spend a day in prison. Okay, these are the types of things that birthed out of that pushback that Lord Acton spoke of. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, having said all of that, let me, where am I at? 12, 16, wow, 16 minutes in. Okay, let me try to rush this. All right, here's a progression. I said I wanted to use those, quotes to present this progression that I see as it relates to class privilege. Now, okay, we talked about the ruling class and those in power. Now, follow this progression. Okay, he who has the power makes the rules. He who makes the rules controls the game. The game here is talking about the game of life. He who has the power, it's the ruling class, he who has the power makes the rules. He who makes the rules controls the game. And he who controls the game controls it in such a way as to privilege those in power. So it's like a circle. It's a loop. It's a closed lock loop. There's a phrase I learned in electronics. It's a closed lock loop. It feeds on itself. And like Frederick Douglass said, if something does not place a demand, that loop, that circle will just continue. He who has the power controls. He who has the power writes the rules. He who writes the rules controls the game. He who controls the game controls it in such a way as to privilege those that have the power. It just comes on all the way back around, and it meets itself. It's closed lock loop, and you have to break into that closed lock loop to start bringing about change. But that closed lock loop exists, folks. It exists. It's very real. Now, someone say, well, prove it. How do you know it's real? He who has the power writes the rules. Let's look at some rules that was written. Let's go back to what's called the Dred Scott decision. Now, I'm going to show you who has the power. Who has the power writes the rules. Now, in the Dred Scott decision, we're going back. And some might argue, well, why are you going all the way back there? Things have changed. Well, I'm going to show. And this series of teachings that I'm working on, it's going to lead to, I'm going to address some things, some of these challenges that have the black community has faced, these, if you will, even assaults on the black community to undermine the black community. We're going to look at, and one of the key things I'm going to move into is redlining. If you want to follow this instruction as it unfolds, go begin to brief yourself and educate yourself on redlining. We're going to look at that and how devastating that was to the black. Matter of fact, let me do this. Okay, this is one of the articles that we're going to be coming from. I'm actually going to use the video. It's called Redlining Was Banned 50 Years Ago. It's Still Hurting Minorities Today. That's an article that we're going to, when we get into redlining, and we're going to show, you know, because some will argue, well, you know, prove that all this progression that you just shared, prove it exists, it's real. Well, who has the power writes the rules. He who writes the rules controls the game. Who controls the game controls it in such a way as to favor or privilege those who has the power. It comes all the way back around, and that just keeps circling, keeps cycling, keeps cycling. Now, again, I said writes the rules. Okay, Dred Scott decision. In the Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott was a slave. Well, he was suing for his freedom and the freedom of his family. Did he get it? Of course not. The decision came down and said a black man has no rights, and he was suing. I have a right to sue, and it came and no, you don't have any rights. You're property. Okay, don't get it twisted. See, that's how the privileged class was talking. So anyway, so he sues. Obviously, he loses, and this decision is made. This decision comes down that says black people have no rights that white people have to respect or acknowledge. And this is what led to Bubba sitting in court, knowing he's not going to spend a day in prison, yet he just blew up a church and killed 4, in situations like this. This is where that birthed out of, and I talked about redlining. Again, this video is not on redlining, but we're going to talk about how black communities was set up. It was framed. It was set up for failure, and it's failing to this day. We just read the article. Go back this video up and go get that title. I might get a chance to reach over there and share it again. But okay, so folks, it's ample proof that the progression I just gave is real. The cycle, it just keeps from the privileged class. It just in America, it's not just a white thing. If in Africa, there were dictators, I'm sure, and then this black privilege. It's in any culture where there's a privileged class, and in America, people can argue and all, and please argue me on this. I'm gonna post this, and if you want to go down in the comments, argue me if you think that I'm just making up stuff and I don't have any evidence and I don't have any proof of what I'm saying. Please argue me on this, please, because I want to deal with this and those who think that they got some kind of angle on this and I'm making up stuff. Okay, now I mentioned something. I think I mentioned that I've done this video a few times, so I've started and stopped it. But let me, if I didn't mention about passive class privilege and active class privilege. I define active class privilege as those pulling the strings. For example, in redlining in 1930, those who drew up those maps for the purpose of herding blacks into certain communities and keeping money and wealth out of that community, or creating situations where wealth wouldn't come to that community. And as it said in redlining, it's affecting communities to this very day. Those who actively made those types of decisions. Now, there are those that passively benefit from this privilege, being a part of the privileged class. No, they may be very, free from not a racist bone in their body, but because they were born into this privileged class, it's certain things that just automatically come towards them that's just real. And let me give you an example of one that I think is very significant. And I'm going to do this, and I'm going to close this video because I'm already at 23 minutes. I'm going to close this particular video out after I do this. Example. Okay, let's just say it's 1945. And in 1945, lynchings were taking place. It was occurring quite frequently throughout the South and throughout those areas that that occurred. And so, we could have, matter of fact, wow, I'm going to throw this example. There was a young lady about 4 years ago. She just got a letter of apology from, I think it was Montgomery. Now, she's not a young lady now. 4 or 5 years ago, she was 80 something when this letter came. Okay, when she was in her 20s, that's some 60 years earlier, back in the whatever that would be, 1950s or whatever that. Do the math. Walking home, truck pulls up, 4 Caucasians in it. They grab her, they abuse her, they rape her, they beat her, and throw her aside. Okay, she has the audacity to try to press charges. Her father had to sit on their front porch with a shotgun to try to fend off. Obviously, nothing happened. I mean, Bubba sat in the courtroom. Nothing happened to Bubba and the other three, as you would expect in that time, and they got off scot free. They didn't have any concerns about doing any day, not one day in prison, jail, and so the city, I think it was Montgomery, somewhere up North Alabama, reviewed this case. This is some 60 years later. Reviewed this case, realized how this woman became the villain in this community because she had the audacity to try to seek justice. They came under attack. Okay, well, whatever happened and whoever pushed this through, someone learned about the story some 60 years later and felt compelled to apologize to this woman. She was still alive. She may be still alive now, and they apologized. And so I say that because, again, in that period of time, black people had to be careful where you walked, where you went. Ask Emmett Till. You can't because he's dead, because he was murdered, because he was supposedly looked at a white woman wrong, and he ended up at the bottom of a river. Okay, in that period of time, you had to be extremely careful. Now, the psychological impact that this had on you, that you had to carry that kind of stress of where you went, what you said, looking at a white man in his eyes could get you beat down, walking on the same side of the street, not crossing the other side. If you were black and white couple came up the street, could get you shot, killed, hung. You could just be walking down the street minding your own business, not really doing anything, and some good old boys decide they just feel like hanging somebody tonight. And folks, you think I'm just being dramatic and whatnot. This was the reality in this country. And it hadn't been that, 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, this was a reality. Okay. And so imagine, now I'm giving you an example of white privilege, this class privilege, even if you're passively involved. You're not the one calling the shots. You're not the one calling, but because you were favored to be in that class, be a part of that class, because you were born in that class, you get certain privileges. And it's clear, folks. You can get mad and whatever. It's a reality. It's too much evidence. The young man is he's unlearned. He's in that bubble. He's got the bubble syndrome going on. This is a reality, and it still happens today. Okay, so you have this situation where this was the climate for black people in the rural South, back then. Okay, so you got to watch where you go. You got to be careful. Anybody could roll up and it could be over. You could be hanging from a tree. You got to watch what you say, and I mean, just and so forth. And so now let's bring in the example. Let's just say, now this is how we had to walk around at that time. This is how those living at that time had to walk around and live their life in these areas. Not every single area. There's always exceptions, folks. But in the rural South, this life existed. That's why there's a monument in Montgomery that opened, I think, this very year, about those who were lynched, and I'm sure they don't even have a close to the full number, but those who were killed. That's what that memorial in Montgomery did open. Okay, so now imagine, let's say you are a white young boy, 15 years old. You're a white young boy, 15 years old. When you walk to the store, you walk the neighborhood, do you have to worry about, I got to watch what I say, I got to watch what I do, I got to watch, there's certain, customs here that I got to adhere to, or I could be killed. Does a 15-year-old young white boy in 1945, did he have that burden to carry around in his mind? Did he had to concern himself with that? How many white Emmett Tills does history record? Just because you looked at a black person wrong, you hanging and you strapped to metal and you in the bottom of the sea, bottom of the river. How many? So does a white boy 15 had to worry about walking down the street and getting snatched up and hanging from a tree the next day? Did that happen in the South? In any part of America? Did that happen? So whether you like it or not, folks, that's white privilege. That's class privilege. And Caucasians were the ruling class at that time. And we still have elements of that, even now. And we're going to look at that as we go into this deeper. Okay, that's just one of many examples. But that's the type, that's the kind. See, just to have peace of mind, to walk, to live, to function in your society, to function in your community, and not worry about somebody kicking your door in and dragging you out in your own yard, hanging you from your own tree. You don't have to worry about that. Nobody Caucasian. The only time a Caucasian might have had to worry about that is if they were what they call a white nigger or a nigger lover. They were partial and you know, respectful to the black community, and others didn't like it. The only time a white person had to worry about that, had that burden on their mind. You understand? Well, they had other burdens and challenges. Yeah, we had other burdens and challenges too, to include we could end up hanging from a tree if we looked at somebody wrong, minding our own business, and somebody just decided they want to have a hanging party tonight. I'm gonna close this now because I've gone, wow, 30 minutes. I'm gonna close this. This is my take on white privilege, class privilege. If it suits you, it's a reality, folks. And you know, I don't, you know, this young man, again, the next video I do, I'm gonna do a walkthrough and highlight some of his what I feel is his errors in reasoning. God bless.